Everyone, and welcome to Stories from the Cold Dead Hands, a radio show where we talk about those who we have lost to the different forms of gun violence in this country. I'm Dr. Benjamin Dowd Arrow. I am an internationally recognized gun scholar, having published multiple papers on things like firearms and well-being and how it relates to our health, as well as the social determinants of gun ownership and gun policy support. In other words, why do people own guns and why do they support certain policies? My co-host is Brett Cross. Brett?
Yes, I'm Brett Cross. I lost my son Uzziah in the Robb Elementary shooting here in Uvalde, Texas on May 24th, 2022. Since then, I have just continued to fight to make sure that his legacy and his memory continues on, because we all know that in today's day and age, with mass shootings becoming more and more frequent, that the victims get forgotten, and they just end up being a statistic. So we keep fighting so that everybody knows who Uzziah was.
All right, so now let's introduce our guest. Scree, if you would like to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about why you're here with us tonight.
Sure. So my name is Kareem Pennebaker. My mother, Joyce, completed suicide with a gun on September 8th, 1979. She was only 27 years old. I was not even 2 years old yet. So I'm sure we're going to get to this in a little bit, but I don't know much about my mom at all, especially as it relates to things that I can tangibly hold on to or memories that I can hold on to. I don't have any of those things because I wasn't into them. But I have dedicated my life after, unfortunately, it took the awakening from the Sandy Hook mass shooting to realize that, not only am I a part of this community of fellow gun violence survivors, but I've got a voice and I need to use it. And I found that advocating for common sense gun reform, it was a good way to use my pain as fuel to do something good. So that's where I am now.
Yeah, so suicide is one of those topics that a lot of people, especially when we talk about firearms, they tend to want to avoid, right? We tend to want to gloss over. But roughly 55% of all gun deaths in the United States are by suicide. And especially when it comes to men, a firearm is the most often used implement to complete suicides in the United States. Now, for women, it's more spread out. It makes up about 33%. But when we think about suicide implements, less than 5% of those people who attempt suicide with a firearm will survive, whereas less than 15% will die from any other method, right? So, this is one of those things that we often gloss over, especially when we talk about gun control. So I'm really interested in this conversation tonight. Brett?
No, yeah, absolutely. When I first got into this space, like you said, it's not really talked about, right? And I spend the majority of my time speaking on mass shootings and everything, but as we all have to do, even though we have our specifics that we talk about, the gun violence encompasses a whole lot more than just mass shootings and just suicides and just domestic violence attacks. There is a lot of different ways that gun violence affects people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you mentioned that you didn't really know your mom. How did that affect you kind of growing up, right? Knowing, first of all, how old were you when you found out what happened to her?
So I unfortunately remember the day. So there are two distinct moments in my life relative to this specific issue with my mom's death that will forever be the worst days of my life. The first one was I was roughly 18 years old. I was a senior in high school. And as, every curious teenager does, they go through their parents' stuff. And I was digging through my dad's boxes of stuff in the basement, and I came across about 100 copies of her death certificate. So up until that point, I obviously knew that my mom was not here, but the story that my family had told me was that she died of an illness, which, you can make the argument that is overarchingly correct, right? They just did not understand or know how to tell me that story. And I don't want to be in any person's shoes to have to deliver that kind of news to a child. I don't think there is a good way to do it. There might be a better way, but I don't think there's a good way. So I found out by literally reading her death certificate when I was about 18 years old. Then we just simply did not talk about it, and it was devastating when I found out. I had to go through some really intense therapy. I think I missed 2 weeks of school, just because I was just like, I was angry. I had already been angry because I felt abandoned because my mom's not here. But I felt even more abandoned. And like, how could you do this to me? Now, again, this is in the mindset of an 18-year-old kid. I didn't know anything yet. I didn't understand the dynamics of like real interpersonal relationships and how guns played a part in all that, and mental health. Plus, you got to consider when she did it, was 1979. We didn't have the health care then that we have now, and it's still woefully inadequate today. But those kinds of topics just were not discussed. You just moved on as best you could, and I couldn't. I just could not handle it, and I was extremely angry. I was angry at the world. And then the second worst moment was Erica Lafferty is a dear friend of mine. Erica's mom, Dawn, was a principal at Sandy Hook, and Erica and I, we would help each other through, these dark waves when they come. And she had suggested at one point that I get a copy of the death certificate because I didn't have it at the time. This was, I think, 2015 or 16, somewhere like that, 14, somewhere like that. And my dad and I sat and talked about it. And I went through the steps and I got it, and it came in the mail, and it was just like a punch in the throat. It was like reliving it all over again, but almost like it was like when it really happened in 1979, because now I'm an adult. Now I can process things better than I could at 18. And it wasn't like I was conceptualizing the act itself, but I was conceptualizing like the moment and reliving all of that, and all of that anger just came rushing back. And I wish I would have handled that better, to be honest with you. I wish I would have prepared myself for reading it, and I just was not mentally equipped at the time with the tools I needed to process what it was like to read about how my mom ended her life, and I just could not handle it. But I went through a lot of therapy, and what it really boiled down to was that sense of abandonment, and how it has impacted me for my entire life, is that it has prevented me from really having substantive relationships with people, because I always feel like you're going to leave. And it is ultimately true. People will leave, whether that is by choice or by life. I mean, we're all going to pass away at some point, and I'm not a morbid person, but I just felt that if my mom can leave me, so can you. So I might as well prepare myself in advance so that I can insulate myself from having to relive that kind of pain. And it's a brutal and unfortunate way of living. And it's isolating, because you don't get to build those kinds of connections with people that you might normally think you would be able to do. My dad did remarry when I was 7 years old, and I just did not allow her the opportunity for the majority of my youth to have that kind of connection with me, because I felt like, well, my mom was already gone. Not only can you not replace her, but you're going to leave me too, right? So I can't let that happen to me again. So I might as well have this wall. And I regret it. Like, there are not many things you'll find in my life that I say I regret. That is one of those things where I just shielded myself away from people so I wouldn't be hurt. So I wouldn't have to keep reliving what it's like to lose your mom over and over again. And that's also the further mistakes that I've made, is that I kept like projecting my mom's death, or my mom's absence, on other people. So it was like when a relationship would end, or some kind of engagement would end, it was like, my mom's gone again. Regardless of what the situation was, it was always that. And it made every single thing infinitely worse. whether you're breaking up with a girlfriend, or you lose a job, or I might lose a contract for a project or something. And to me, it's the end of the world. When in reality, it's just another day in life, right? If I had the right mindset to deal with it, I do now, thank God, through a lot of therapy. But it really did force me to analyze myself and my outlook on life, and really appreciate who I'm dealing with rather than what I think I'm dealing with, which was the hardest out of all the stuff I've had to go through. That's the hardest, is being able to understand that I'm dealing with the person that I'm looking at, rather than the consequence of someone who is mentally unwell and had easy access to a gun. That is, I don't even know if I can put into words how hard that truly is, to really see people as they are, rather than seeing them as a representation of my mom in her absence. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think Brett and I could probably both really relate to this. I see Brett nodding his head. You know, the very first time I was ever a pallbearer was for my grandmother, who committed suicide when I was 12. She was also a gun suicide. She had attempted numerous times before that. I have several gun suicides in my family, and I've attempted myself. And I think it's the fact that I have children now is why I won't do it, even though I am still quote unquote suicidal, right? But I can't put them through what you went through, right? Like, I was always detached and didn't never feel close to my family for different dynamics we won't go into, but you know, I could see them having a similar reaction to you if I did that to myself.
Right. You know, what is interesting is that, so I'm also someone who was attempted. So before I keep going, I never say the word committed. I always say completed, because to me there's a stigma that comes along with talking about suicide and people. I mean, when you commit a crime, I mean, you this is not what happened with my mom was not a crime. I mean, when we talk about, like you and I just said, we attempted suicide. The natural progression of that attempt is the completion. So that's just how I talk. I mean, I'm not policing the conversation. It's just one of those things. But I remember distinctly, like a friend of mine and I like to go shooting. This has got to be early 2000s, and we would go quite often. And I had one of those dark waves that hit me one night, and I literally sat there with a loaded 9mm in my mouth for a good half hour. And when I think now as a relatively full functioning adult, like the processes I had to go through for that 30 minutes was not what you might think about. I kept thinking about, like, how many reasons do I have to stay here? And I was come up with blanks. Like, I just I couldn't convince myself that I was worthy enough to stay. And it kept coming back to the same thing. If your mom can leave you, how much value must you have? She couldn't stay for you. She didn't fight for you, right? She gave up on you. I didn't ask to be born. I didn't ask to be born to a mother who was struggling with severe mental illness and didn't have help for it. Now I got to bear the consequence of it. I just did not know how to process it at the time. Thankfully, now this is, I mean, whether you believe in this kind of stuff or not, doesn't matter to me. This is what I think happened. I mean, I believe this with every ounce of my being, that it literally was my mind in the darkest of my darkest moment that made me think about my daughter. And it was just like something clicked. No matter how painful that situation was, I just thought about her. And, you know, Sydney is now 25 years old, and thank God I called a friend, and I have not touched a gun since, nor will I ever. I don't believe that I should, because I believe a lot like with heroin, that kind of thing, suicidality just does not go away. And thankfully I have the right tools and mechanisms and coping mechanisms in place now that I know what to do when those moments happen. But I talk about these things when I get on the stage, and I'll tell people, that, I have, been through the worst thing you can imagine as a child, losing a parent to gun suicide, and then having to live through the absence of it, only to be almost full circle with it. Like we were here, right? Where she was not able to make the choice because depression was lying to her, making her believe that my world would be better off without it. Now, I had the moment to decide. Thankfully, I was able to do so and think about my daughter and think, I cannot continue this cycle. That my daughter deserved to have a better life than I did. I mean, and every parent wants that, right? To make sure that their future is brighter than yours has been. And I wanted to make sure that I was going to be around for it. That there's so many things that my mom has missed. Basic things. She didn't teach me how to brush my teeth. She didn't teach me how to tie my shoes. Watch me ride a bike. Watch me graduate from high school and watch me get a scholarship for track to college. She didn't see any of these things. She missed the births of my 3 children, my marriage. She missed every failure, every success. She missed all of my allergy appointments. She didn't get to see me go to prom, right? Like things that you would associate that with being with your mother like that. And I didn't know how to receive love. I didn't know how to give love. I had to learn all these things the hard way by making the mistakes. But thankfully, I was able to surround myself with the right people. And, I was able to get into the community of fellow gun violence survivors and not just like trauma farm, right? We weren't just complaining. I just needed to understand what I was dealing with and how do you process that? And how do you talk about that? And then it became more like, how do I own this? And instead of like letting those dark waves control me, how do I find ways to control it? And then how do I find ways to take the pain that I do have and channel it in a way that at least gives me some semblance of freedom, mental freedom, so that when depression starts lying to me, and it often does, I know how to fight back against it. And it's really been the strength that, you sitting with fellow gun violence survivors and listening to their stories and their triumphs over their tragedy and seeing how they're pushing through. And like, you know what? I got to do the same thing. I have to find ways to talk about this. Unfortunately, with the issue of gun suicides, it is, like you mentioned earlier, it is rarely talked about, especially in the suicide community. The means is rarely, it's almost frowned upon to talk about. But to me, because it is the overwhelming majority segment of gun violence in that segment, but also in suicide, it's the majority of suicide completions is with a gun, but nobody wants to talk about it. A lot of times it's the stigma that comes with it, which I understand. A lot of times it's the guilt, the survivor's guilt of it. A lot of times it's just a lack of understanding. Some people just don't want to have those kind of tough conversations. I don't blame them.
Yeah.
Like, who wants to do this, right? I didn't ask to do this.
Yeah.
I'm forced to.
And when we think about that stigma, though, like that's really something that we should move past, right? So, like when I attempted, I chased a bottle of pills with a bottle of wine because I don't like pain, and in my mind, I was afraid if I used a gun, I might not actually die and end up paralyzed or something, a vegetable, and kept alive. I'm in Florida where they've kept people alive for decades when they shouldn't have. But when we think about, guns and suicide, one of the things that we forget is that fact that if a person uses a gun, there's no thinking, oh my God, I'm making a mistake, I need to seek help, right? Like if I chase a bottle of pills and suddenly I think, oh my God, I actually want to live, I can dial 911, have the ambulance come get me, take me to the hospital, pump my stomach, possibly save my life. But if you use a gun, like I said, less than 5% of those who use a gun will survive. And even those that do, the vast majority have major health issues like their whole life. Now, Brett and I have talked about before on here, I know he's turned his camera off, but he's still there. We talked before on here how we're both gun owners, and one of the things that I've mentioned numerous times here and in other places where, I'm talking about this topic is that I don't keep ammunition at home, and I still keep the gun locked in the safe. Now, part of that is because I have a 10-year-old and a 9-year-old, and I don't want them finding the gun. They don't know that I own a gun. It's locked in a safe. But the other part of that is for the very thing you mentioned, right? Because it is like any other disease. It's never cured. It never goes away. Those dark thoughts are always there. And if I have such ease of access, as I just mentioned, I can't change my mind if that's what I try.
Right. There's a guy, Kevin is his first name. I don't remember his last name anymore. But he started an organization called The Ripple Effect, if you're familiar with him. He's one of the few people in history that has ever jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge and survived. And there's an interview he gave. Trying not to cry, sorry.
That's okay.
So there's an interview he gave where he said the second he let go and he jumped, he knew instantly he didn't want to die. But there was no coming back now. And he said he hit the water. It was like 1,000 needles hitting him at one time, and he broke, I think, every bone in his body, and he survived. But he's one of the rare ones that do. And I'm glad that he did, but you rarely get the opportunity to come back from a gunshot. There's a woman that I have been in contact with over the years. Christine is her name. She put a 44 caliber under her chin and tried to complete suicide and survive. And it tore apart her face. And she's still alive, but like as you mentioned, has gone through, I think at the time it was like 30 or 40 different surgeries. And, it is just grueling, but she's glad that she's alive now.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate that people don't understand and appreciate just how crippling and devastating that depression can be. And especially as men, and then men of color, we are not really trained or taught how to talk about our feelings. I'm not talking about just, I love this person. It's true, honest depression. And how do you deal with those kinds of things? And then being able to feel okay with asking for help. We don't talk about those things.
No.
Me hear all the time about be a man and do this. I think what being a man is understanding you need some help, go ask for it, and then advocate for other people to do the same, so you can open that door and then tear apart those barriers, so more and more men can seek the help that they need, so that we have fewer men who are attempting and completing suicide or doing other things that are harmful to themselves or their family. These stigmas that surround these issues are brutally unfair. And we have an entire society structure built around keeping those things in place, which I think is cruel. I want to see us get to a place where, whether you're a man or woman, black or white or anything else, that you feel completely safe, free, and unjudged about getting the help you need. And I think once we get to a place like that, you will see suicide rates plummet.
Yeah.
There are other social issues that go into why suicidality is an issue. But if we can at least make sure people feel safe in getting help, that they aren't going to be further stigmatized when they do, that by itself will cause a drop in the rates. Plus, you mentioned that you and Brett are gun owners here in Wisconsin, especially here in Wisconsin, and probably the majority of states around the country. It is easier to go buy a gun than it is to get that first mental health care appointment.
Yep, 100%. And so you brought up a lot of really good topics, right? Like, so as men, we are only allowed to express anger and lust in society. That's it. That's all we're allowed to do, is express anger or lust. All other emotions, we're told to suck it up and be a man, to use your own words, right? And there is intersectionality there as well, right? Like, because we definitely see that there are stronger pushes to those narratives in, say, the black community comparatively to like the white community. And so like when we start looking at those societal narratives, right, like we can see then when men are forced to evaluate their feelings, it's uncomfortable. Like look at what has been happening on TikTok with the man or the bear scenario, and how so many men had these emotional temper tantrums because they could not handle expressing emotions other than, the anger, so they lashed out at women for calling us on our bullshit, right? Like, and pointing out the ways that we have failed them. And so I think you're right that if we could address some of those root causes, right, which is toxic masculinity, because we live in a society that doesn't allow us, like if I were to start crying in public, people would like walk away from me, right? And so if we can't get to a point where we can healthily express these emotions, we will continue to see not only suicide, but the other forms of gun violence, right? Because those things are all linked to that.
Yeah. There was to your point about masculinity. There's an organization here in Wisconsin, about 45 minutes south of here. It's called the Yellow Brick Road, and it was started by a group of folks who were mental health care professionals. And what they were trying to do back in 2019, was to have their first Pride Parade in Beloit, Wisconsin. And so they're raising money, and they were like, they're going to have a celebrity drag show. And a friend of mine, not trying to be funny, was like, hey, I'm going to nominate Karee to be one of the performers. So at first I was like, well, I'm glad you consider me to be a celebrity. That's pretty cool, right? But then I was like, oh, I got to dress in drag. And then I kind of got all my feelings about it. But then I was like, you know what? How dare I not? Right? I think, to kind of cast off that kind of stigma, I'm just going to go do it. I'm comfortable with my own sexuality. I know who I am. I'm going to go have fun with it. So I did the performance, and I read the poem, and Still I Rise. The first one I did was Let America Be America Again, by Langston. And
after and Sojourner Truth, then you did, because you did the Still I Rise as well.
So the second year I did in Still I Rise, which I actually have tattooed on my back.
Oh, very nice.
But after the performance was done, I was still kind of like, kind of out of it, because it's kind of overwhelming, because if you've been to a drag show, it's very over the top. There's a lot of makeup, a lot of hair, a lot of flamboyance and dancing. So I sat down, and this woman comes up to me in tears, and she says, because before I read the poem, I gave a speech basically introducing myself and talking about how my mom completed suicide, how I attempted, and how a majority of trans or members of the LGBTQ community attempt before the age of 22. So how dare I not come try to be a voice, or at least show solidarity with them. So this mom comes up to me, and she's in tears, and she says, my son is transitioning and attempted suicide, and he's actually in a mental health care facility this weekend because he attempted the day before. And it was that kind of thing. It's like, you never know who you might reach, and whose voice you might help elevate, or who you might help feel seen. Because a lot of times, whether it's with suicide or gun violence in general, a person feels isolated in one way or the other. Oftentimes, I'll give these speeches to all these crowds, and at the end of it, I will typically say that we often hear about people who want to say, they'll say something like, I want to change the world. And I'll simply say, well, you can. By doing something simple and kind. Open the door for someone. Smile. Buy a person a cup of coffee. Buy them lunch. Just say something nice. And you could literally change that person's world, because they will have felt seen. That kind of power that we have that we don't use is cruel. I don't think people understand and appreciate how valuable small random acts of kindness can be, and how they truly can change the world.
Yeah. And I want to go back to something you just said, because this has been my experience too. Because you and I feel like are a lot alike in a lot of ways. I think we're probably about the same age. I was born in '77, and we've had some similar experiences in a couple of ways. And what I've learned, and the reason I continue to talk about my suicide story is basically exactly what you just said, right? Is that there's always one or two people. So every semester when I teach the Guns and Society course here at FSU, I tell that story when I teach the lecture on guns and suicides. And in that class, it ends up being emotional. I can't get through it without crying. I don't know if you have that experience as well when you talk about it. It's been 10 years for me, and I still cry every time. And it is a rehearsed speech when I tell it now, and I still cry. But at the end of it, there's always one or two students that come up and say something along the lines of, this hit me, this way. I was thinking these things, I was feeling these things, and hearing you say it has made me want to seek out help. And it's especially important when it's men, right? And which is why I feel it's important that I continue telling that story, is because as men, as we talked about, we're not allowed to express those kinds of emotions, right? And I preface the class, I tell them the class before, we're going to cry. And when I start the class, it's like, here's your trigger warning. Today's topic, we are going to cry in this classroom. And we go through it. But I think that's super important because it allows, these young men, because, I teach at the grad level and undergrad level, but typically the average age is 25, right? So that they can see an older man who is willing to say, hey, this is just reality, right? Everybody has bad mental health days, and some of us actually I have PTSD and, a couple of other things that I deal with on a daily basis. These are realities, and this is what can happen if you are not in therapy, if you are not seeking help and, talking to people about what you are feeling. I like to use the John Mulaney joke, right? He's like, your dads don't have friends. Your moms have friends who have husbands, right? Because when you think about us as men, we only keep our friendships, that's the people we work with or we see. But if we change jobs, we typically don't have those friendships anymore, right? I have one person from high school I still talk to, right? Everybody else that I'm friends with are typically just people I work with that I see. And if those people quit or I quit and moved on, I would just make new friends somewhere else. But what happens when I retire, right? And we see for men that suicide is a increasing curve. It just continues to get bigger and bigger for every age group, especially once we hit retirement, where our only friend is our spouse. And if we end up divorced or widowed, right, we can't cope because we haven't been trained.
Right. There was so for years I would put typically on my mother's birthday, which is June 25th, June 26th. I'm sorry. So I would go on Facebook and I'd write these things and post pictures and blah blah. After one of them, a contracting friend of mine who I've known for 20-some years sent me a message saying, hey, I had recently attempted suicide. He didn't, obviously didn't pull the trigger, but he said he sat there with his AR-15 and was struggling because his business wasn't doing well and all kinds of things. And he said he literally thought about what I had written the day before about my mom. And then he was like, I understood the part that you wrote about not wanting to continue the cycle and not wanting to do this to your kids. He was like, I couldn't do it, but it was my story that had helped him through it. And it's like, maybe this is justification, I don't know, but to me it's like, well, I can't undo what's been done, right? So I got to do something with it. I might as well share it. It has often been cathartic for me to share my story. It has often been traumatizing to do it. Because for a number of years, I treated my moments on stage as my therapy. The problem is when I got off the stage, that's what I couldn't process. I got so addicted to that stage presence and what it meant. There have been moments where I gave a speech on the start of Pride Fest a couple years ago at the state capitol, and there was a man and woman standing within feet, like 2 feet from me, with their guns in their holsters, because it's an open carry state, and trying to intimidate me. And the whole time, because I can speak extemporaneously, I don't really write down anything. And the whole time I'm speaking, I'm not even thinking about what I'm saying. I have no idea what to say. It was a good speech, but I'm thinking about the guns that's close to me and what I would do if I could touch it. That's where my mind went. But it's like if I don't put myself in these positions to talk about something so brutal and unfair, how is somebody else going to be able to navigate through it themselves? Somebody's got to open the door, right? Somebody's got to show this is how you talk about it, even when I get it wrong. And I do. There are things that I know that I have said that I wish I could unsay or say better the next time. But there's no cliff notes to this, right? There's no guidebook to try to figure out stuff. I've been scripted. I've been on presidential campaigns. I've been part of Everytown for gun safety and all the spokesperson stuff I did for them. But there's nothing you can learn except by just simply doing it. And there are just not enough people talking about that kind of lived experience, about what it's like to deal with suicidality. There just isn't, especially in a way that isn't going to avoid the means. And I can't conceptualize what that means to ignore that part. Because it's like if you have someone in your family that's an alcoholic, you're not gonna ignore alcohol presence, right? You're just not gonna
Right.
You're not gonna leave if someone is addicted to opioids. You're not just gonna be like, it's not a big deal if we talk about opioids or Vicodin or Percocet. We can leave bottles around. We're not gonna do that. We behave completely different when it becomes something that has been deemed to be controversial, and it shouldn't be. Gun violence is something that impacts every single one of us, whether you're Republican or Democrat. Republicans die from gun violence just like Democrats do. The bullets do not care. I gave I testified at our state Senate a couple years ago, shortly after one of the Senate Republican colleagues had completed suicide with a gun, and I brought him up in the hearing, and I'm like, I don't know how any of you can behave this way. One of your counterparts just killed himself, and you're sitting there talking about gun rights. He doesn't have them anymore. He doesn't. Like the bullets that tore the bodies apart of the first graders at Sandy Hook. They didn't ask. The bullets never asked, hey, what party are you going to subscribe to when you become an adult? Or what party are your parents members of? The bullet that exploded my mom's head never once asked her, what is your son going to grow up to be? That doesn't happen. So why it gets framed the way that it does is shameful to me. And it's something I don't think, people who are genuinely concerned about alleviating this kind of trauma, I don't think it should be a thing.
Yeah. No, I agree. We mentioned Sandy Hook a couple of times now. For me, Sandy Hook was a turning point, right? And I think you kind of hinted to that too. Before Sandy Hook, I owned probably, between me and my roommate, 17, 18 different types of rifles, and a lot of those are like the military style AR-15 looking kind of rifles, and 3 or 4 handguns. And then Sandy Hook happened, and I'm someone who has always known, even before I really got into the data and started doing research on this, that you can't really use a gun to defend yourself. For me, a gun was always something to go to the range. It was a very lethal toy, right? It's a toy, though, still, right? I was buying it to go to the range. And then Sandy Hook happened, and suddenly people were placing that toy at higher value than children's lives. And I wish I could say that I donated them to be destroyed, that I got rid of them that way, but I did sell them all. Like, I got rid of all my guns, and I didn't own another gun until the pandemic happened, when the price of ammunition and range time shot through the roof, and it was going to cost me $500 to $600 to rent a gun, buy their ammunition, and shoot for an hour at the range. And I'm like, I could buy my own gun and use my own ammunition for that. But I had at that point was like, I'm not going to buy another gun until we actually like do something about gun violence. And I lasted about 8-9 years before that changed. But you've mentioned Sandy Hook a couple of times, so it seems like that was a turning point for you as well.
It was, and it was a little bit different. So I have not touched a gun, a real gun, since maybe 2003 when I had attempted with at that time. So about a few months before Sandy Hook happened, so maybe August of 2012, a good friend of mine who is a tactical instructor. So he actually teaches for a concealed carry permit, but he also teaches tactical classes for SWAT and all kinds of places. He was like, "Hey, I'm putting together a class for concealed carry permit. Would you be interested in taking it?" And I wasn't then, nor am I now anti-gun at all. Not at all. And I'm like, sure, I took the class, and it happened to be a few days before Sandy Hook. And I actually got the permit like 14 days after Sandy Hook. And it just was happenstance that the time, worked out like that. And so then after the class, Sandy Hook now has happened. I did some research. I was gonna actually buy a gun for the house, and my wife at the time was like, "You of all people should know why you should not have a gun in the house. Not that anybody shouldn't, but I shouldn't." So I just started doing some research, and I happened to come across Mayors Against Illegal Guns, and 1 Million Moms for Gun Control is what it was called back then. So Mayors Against Illegal Guns turned into Everytown for Gun Safety. 1 Million Moms turned into Moms Demand Action. And that's how I really got involved, was by finding that those two organizations, by doing the research on whether or not I should have a gun. Now, I didn't buy one. And it kind of catapulted me into the movement of advocating for common sense gun reform. And that was like part of it. My main thing was advocating for gun violence awareness. Because once a lot of the time, especially in that moment, in the few years after that, the conversation really was about mass shootings. Brett was saying the same thing, and there's obviously clearly nothing wrong with advocating for the elimination of mass shootings, because it impacts everybody. Plus, with mass shootings, creates further depression, which leads to more suicide. So it's a ripple effect, the never-ending circle of trauma. But in doing so, not only did I learn about like how to talk about gun violence, I was like, well, I have got a platform. This is the space where I need to start talking more and more about gun suicide and pushing them to advocate for conversations and advocacy around gun suicide. And it took a minute, because it's hard to shift that narrative and that conversation away from something as massive and traumatic as Sandy Hook. And those situations kept happening. You had the Aurora Theater mass shooting, you had Parkland, Pulse, you name it, Uvalde. They are never ending. They always get the headlines, but it is actually rather infrequent compared to stories like mine.
Yeah.
And in getting people to understand, wanting to talk about something in addition to doesn't mean I'm taking away from the conversation that we started with. I want to talk about all of it. I want to talk about mass shootings, gun suicides, street violence, unintentional child shootings, interpersonal or interrelational gun violence with spouses, all of it. We should be able to talk about all of those things, and every single one has methods that we need to talk about on how to deal with those specific segments. But it's a hard thing to do. But at the same time, if you look at where we are today versus where we were 15 years ago, it's night and day. You don't have, especially Democrats are not running from the issue of gun violence prevention. You have common sense Republicans that are talking about common sense gun reform. And I think that's a good thing, where you get people who are getting to a place where it has become more acceptable to talk about saving lives. And it happens in a broad range of circles. And I think the more of us who are willing to commit to talking about these difficult issues that are not controversial, it just gets classified as such. But the more of us who are willing to do it, the more opportunity we have of really, really honestly saving people's lives.
Yeah, and I agree. And, to touch on a couple of things, like, first of all, like, it's, what would reduce one form of gun mortality will reduce all forms of gun mortality, right?
Mm-hmm.
States with stricter laws have fewer gun suicides, fewer gun homicides, fewer gun mass shootings, and fewer accidental deaths, right? And what we find is that for suicides in particular, states with stricter laws have fewer suicides. For men, it's gun suicides, but for women, it's suicides by any method, right? Like, all of that comes down in states with stricter gun laws. That's weird, right? Like, that's connected. The other thing is that, it shouldn't be viewed as a competition, right? It should be viewed instead of, we are trying to save lives, as you put it. Like, some of the things that we have found that actually work is working with, like, gun stores and ranges to recognize the signs of depression, especially in veterans, right? Because they tend to love veterans, and we know that 22 veterans attempt and complete suicide a day. So, like, trying to stop that number, and the gun stores and ranges tend to get on board with that, right? When you make it clear, we're not trying to deny them their gun rights, we're trying to give you a customer and keep your customer there, right? Because, as you said, I'm not anti-gun. I am anti-bullshit excuses for why we have guns, right? You're not John Wick, right? You're not John McClane. You're not Rambo. You're not going to stop a mass shooting with your Glock, right? So let's use, like, common sense to figure out, like, how can you have your hobby? If you want to carry one, what do you need to do to carry one so that I know you're safe with it and people are safe around you? But the bullshit excuses, I'm not for that at all.
Right. And what's interesting, I'll get back to another point in a second, but what's interesting about that last part you're talking about, that you're really not likely to stop, whether it's a mass shooting or a homicide or robbery, you're less likely to do that, but you're more likely to shoot or kill someone that you know or you love. But when I took that concealed carry class back in 2012, one of the first things the instructor, who again is a dear friend, was like, he talks about disengaging from the scenario rather than trying to engage, whether you are armed or not. Leave if you can. Because no matter what you teach in this 4-hour class, you're not SWAT trained, right? You're not going to be able, again, like you mentioned, you're not going to be John Wick and be able to go in and do all these things. But we've really allowed that kind of narrative to fester. Well, not we. The NRA really has in the gun death lobby and all that, where they make it seem like it's a manly thing to do. They even ran ads at one point, like, I can't remember who it was, but like taking someone's man card.
Yeah, Bushmaster. Bushmaster ran the AR-15 man card.
Right. With that kind of nonsense, making people believe that you can stop a mass shooting if only you were armed. Well, Columbine would tell you that's not the case, right? Because they were that too.
Right.
Parkland, same thing. Same thing happened in the Tucson mass shooting.
Yeah.
Where armed people were there, but couldn't get a clear line of sight to end the shooting.
Well, I specifically mentioned Uvalde because at one point there are 376 officers on site right there, and they still couldn't stop a single shooter, right? Like, they stand there for 77 minutes. I keep saying, I've said it probably on every episode of this show, the good guy with a gun to stop a bad guy with a gun just sounds like a way to sell two guns, right? Because how do you know who the good guy is? When cops show up, they're not going to know who the good guy is and who the bad guy is. So to me, it just sounds like this a really good marketing tool to sell guns to people, which leads to a conversation I have in my classes and we've had on the show before, where who does the NRA actually serve? They claim they serve the gun owner, but there's a case that can be made that they really serve the manufacturer. That's their whole purpose.
There, so oftentimes when people bring up this marketing phrase of the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, they need to think about the Tucson mass shooting. That shooter was stopped by unarmed people. Mm-hmm. One of which was an elderly woman whose name was Pat, who was just love this woman to death. Every time I see her, I tell her that you are a living, breathing superwoman. Mm-hmm. Like, to be able to stop a shooter, like she didn't care about what could have happened to her. She just acted, and it was her for the people that stopped him and grabbed him and tackled him. But they were not armed, and they were able to stop a bad guy with a gun.
I have a video up on TikTok that shows that when a civilian, not police officer or military trained, stomps these people, it's often with an object that's not a firearm, right? For instance, here in Tallahassee, we had an attempted mass shooting because it doesn't meet the FBI's definition. Only 2 people actually died here, but it was stopped by a guy with a broom at a yoga studio. This guy came into the yoga studio. He was an incel. He was wanting to kill women that he felt were denying him sex or whatever, and he was taken out by a guy with a broom that grabbed the broom and just hit him over the back of the head. Then he ended up committing suicide so he wouldn't get arrested. But often it's that, right? Your cell phone is a more lethal implement to stop a mass shooter than you having a gun. Because one of the points that I wanted to mention, when we're talking about that they can't be John Wick, is that fully trained Marines will choke sometimes in combat, right? Because no one knows what you will do in those situations when your adrenaline spikes. You're going to fight, flee, or freeze, right? And you don't know which one of those 3 you are until you're in that moment, right? And, and so many of these people who are thinking they're going to be Rambo or whatever, they freeze. Most of the time they freeze, right? So, it's foolish. I like that your friend was still training the old way of you have a duty to retreat, is what that method is called. Unfortunately, here in Florida, with the adoption of the stand your ground, we were the first state to adopt stand your ground. We don't teach that here anymore, right? So when I moved back to Florida and got my concealed, here, the deputy that was teaching it started the class, and he and I got into an argument over it. But he started the class with, "I'm going to teach you how to stop a mass shooter." And we got into an argument over it. I was like, "No, you can't." And I was like, "Even with all your training, you couldn't." And, he was like, "Well, how do you know?" "Well, what do you mean?" I was like, "Let's say I'm the mass shooter." I was like, "Don't you think, if you had walked into a room, you could eye out the threats and just know who's the threat and who's not?" He's like, "Yeah." He said, "Don't you think the shooter's done that? What happens if you're the first person they shoot? What if they walk up behind you and then shoot you and then start shooting everybody else?" And he's like, "Well, that case," I said, "that's the case most of the time." I teach a class called Guns and Society. I would probably be the best, way to stop a threat, but I'm the first person you see when they walk into a room. How much does my training matter? How much it's all about luck when you're in those situations to begin with. And, unless you just have your gun ready to go 24/7 anyway, you're going to have your gun while you're shopping at the mall ready to take out a threat, right? You're sitting in a movie theater watching the new Marvel movie and you've got your gun like this ready to go, right? It's fantasy land, and between the movies that we watch, the video games that we play, the comics and other things that we read that glorify these lifestyles and these fantasies, I think has given this false sense of empowerment to, especially to young men.
Sure. I haven't had that false sense of empowerment. I think I am the opposite of that. So while I don't go to a theater, well, much anymore, but when I do, I don't go on, obviously. But what I do is I look for where the exits are, how far up the stadium seating I am relative to how far the drop might be if I have to jump over the side. It'll be things like that because of what happened in the Aurora Theater match. Making sure that whoever I'm with has time to get out. Or if there's an exit at the top, or finding those kinds of things. Or if I am shopping, trying to be as situationally aware as I can be, because that stuff can happen.
Yeah.
It can spark up at any second. I'm not trying to profile or anything like that. I'm just trying to look like, am I close to something I can run out? And it's unfortunate. It's gotten to a place where we need to be thinking about the exits rather than the strategies to prevent these things from happening. Because too many people, I think, who are in power have adopted a defeatist perspective in saying, you hear this all the time, where if the bad guy wants to find a gun, he'll find a way. Like if we looked at any policy, that we wouldn't have any policy. People speed every single day. That doesn't mean we don't have speed limits. People complete or commit murder every day. We still have laws against it. I mean, but this is one of the few things that we have already submitted to quitting because bad people get access to guns, or people who shouldn't have them get access to them. We will just give up before we even make the attempt to do the right thing.
It's an asinine argument, but it's also not backed up by facts either, right? Like New York City is not even in the top 150 most deadly cities, and yet it's the most populated city in the United States, right? And it's the city that, like, when we show movies or things or video games about gun violence, that's usually the city we set things in, right? Batman is set in a fictionalized version of Trenton, New Jersey, New York City, right? And yet New Jersey and New York are two of the safest states in the country at 5.3 and 5.4 respectively per 100,000 for gun deaths. Compare that to states like Vermont and Maine that have constitutional carry. They're 3 to 4 times the rate of gun mortality, right? At 12, per 100,000. So, we know that gun laws restrict the flow of guns. I like to quote Ronald Reagan here, right? Like, I hate that man with a passion, and I will say that until my dying day. But there's one thing that I will say about him that is positive, is that he was the most prolific president at trying to pass gun control. And so in 1994, when they were debating the semi-automatic weapons ban, he wrote an open letter to Congress along with Gerald Ford. And
I have read over and over and over.
Yeah. And he said in it, like, while we know getting rid of these weapons will not stop all crime with these weapons, it will dry up the supply, making those crimes rarer and less in occurrence, right? That is a powerful statement. And if we look at other countries that have really restrictive gun policies now, like Australia is a great example because they have a very similar history as the United States. They've not had, anything really since Port Arthur in 1996. And gun crime is statistically zero. And then you'll have people say, oh, they'll use a knife, but knife murders in London, which is the worst city in comparable nations, is still 1 in 6 million, which is about the rate of getting killed by a shark, right? Like that's your statistical probability of getting killed by Jaws, right? It is the getting killed by a knife in London. Like I like to bring up, there was a high school in Pennsylvania where a guy did a mass stabbing. He stabbed 22 people, 2 or 3 of them critically. Nobody died. Not a single person died. You can't say that about guns.
Right. So to piggyback on your point about Reagan, he also wrote a letter about the 48-hour waiting period. In it, he talked about how that would reduce crimes of passion and would reduce gun suicides like my mom. So it's interesting to see how a lot of Republicans will praise Ronald Reagan for a lot of things, but then will have devolved on the issue of gun violence prevention and have adopted this wannabe cowboy mystique when none of them really would be able to step in my shoes and have to live with the trauma that I do. But I mean, I'm glad that Reagan said what he said in both of the, well, one was a letter, but the other one was a op-ed that he wrote.
Op-ed in the New York Times.
Right. That's where he talked about the waiting period. It's unfortunate, though, that it took it happening to him.
Yeah.
For him to take action. But whether the impetus was the gun violence meeting him at his doorstep or not, more people need to speak up about it before it's their turn.
Yeah.
I think that's the thing that gets ignored, is that you are not immune from this, no matter what your zip code is or your skin color.
Yeah.
Gun violence does not kill.
Yeah, let's do a quick reset, and then I want to come right back into this because I think this is a really good way to start the next segment. So hello, everyone who is tuned in. You're listening to Stories from the Cold Dead Hands, where we talk about those who are either survivors of gun violence or lost family members to some form of gun violence. Tonight, we have a special guest who is talking about his own experiences. I will allow him to introduce himself real quick, but first, Brett Cross is not with us tonight. He had a family emergency, so it's just me and Kari tonight. So, Kari, if you would like to reintroduce yourself, we'll move right back in.
Sure. My name is Kari Pennybaker. I am a gun violence survivor. My mom, Joyce, completed suicide with a gun on September 8th, 1979, when she was only 27 years old. And I was not even 2 years old yet. And I have dedicated my life to making sure fewer and fewer people ever have to walk a minute in my shoes.
Yeah. So we were talking at the end of the last segment about the role of Reagan, and you touched on something that I think is super important, and it applies to a lot of different topics. For white men in particular, we do not really care about a topic until it affects us personally, right? And for Ronald Reagan in particular, just weeks after taking office in 1981, there was an attempt on his life by a man named John Hinckley, and it paralyzed his press secretary, James Brady. That's where the Brady handgun bill comes from. And Ronald Reagan was the first president to have ever been endorsed by the NRA, and suddenly he is now the first president endorsed by the NRA pushing for gun control legislation. So he was very heavily involved in the creation of the Brady handgun bill, along with Brady's wife, Sarah. And, he wrote op-eds, as we mentioned in the last segment. He went around the country, he talked about it, he spoke in front of Congress on it, and he also was instrumental in passing the semi-automatic weapons ban. Republicans and Democrats both said in the Senate that they only voted for both of those bills because Ronald Reagan told them to, right? And so we see that, though, that historically gun control is always something that is only passed by Republicans, because Democrats will get blamed for it and Republicans know they can do it. Like, even compare, Presidents Obama versus President Trump, where Obama, after Sandy Hook, said, hey, gun owners and non-gun owners, we need to come together and figure out solutions to prevent this from happening. And following Parkland, Trump said, we should just get rid of due process and take guns from people, right? Like, a Democrat could never say that. A Democrat, if Kamala tried to come forward and say, hey, we're just going to take guns without due process and do due process later, there would be another insurrection, right? Mm-hmm. But Donald Trump says it, and everybody's like, oh, he didn't mean it. He doesn't mean it like that, right? He also passed the bump stocks ban, right? That was recently overturned by SCOTUS. So, we see that historically Republicans will do it. And you mentioned Republicans who were pushing for common sense gun reform, like the Safer Communities Act that was just passed was Marco Rubio, right? Mm-hmm. He's the one who wrote it. So they will do it because they know there's no political, attachment to them, right? Is that how you, as someone who works in politics, is that how we move forward? Do we try and convince more Republicans to get on board with this, since they know that it won't affect their political careers?
I mean, the cynic in me would say yes, that you have to, and because we exist in a political space, you cannot avoid the political requirements that come with the issue. This is a political issue that requires political solutions. That does not mean it doesn't also involve activist involvement or communal involvement, but it does require, from a legal perspective to have politics and politicians involved. So there are some things that we have to do that will manage that side of the equation. I wish it wasn't. I mean, the human in me wishes that American politicians would adopt the way of thinking that the Australian politicians did after Port Arthur, when they, and it was a conservative government at the time, who said that they were willing to risk their jobs to prevent this kind of thing from happening again. And they did lose their jobs, by the way. And they were interviewed, I think, 2012, give or take, and all of them said that they would do it again, that they did not mind losing their job to save people's lives. I don't advocate for the kind of policy of what they did in Australia. That worked for them, that's fine. That's not what I think would be feasible here in America. But we do have some common sense gun reform policies that are broadly supported by both sides of the aisle from a voter's perspective. But we just don't have politicians who are willing to risk their jobs to do it.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, too many politicians are only inspired to do something like that when it touches their doorstep. To go back to Reagan.
Yeah.
I think that we don't have enough courageous politicians in our body politic anymore who are willing to face the issue as the issue and wanting to find a solution. We have politicians who only want the issue. They don't care about the solution, because the issue is what generates buzz and clicks and likes and all of that kind of in airtime on TV.
Yeah.
They're not really interested in solving the problem. So I think if we really got to a point where, like, I don't give a damn about my job, because my job is to help not only make people's lives better, but to save them. And if it means losing my job to do it, so be it. I'm fine with it. We just don't have enough people like that.
Yeah, I agree. I think another issue too, on top of all that, is the Citizens United ruling that allows people to just let massive amounts of money. And while overwhelmingly it is Republicans who are the recipients of the gun lobby money, right? There are Democrats who get it too. Just across the state line in Georgia is a Representative Sanford Bishop. He is a Democrat. He is the highest paid Democrat by the NRA. Right, like he has an A rating with the NRA. He only gets like $200,000 a year, but that's still a lot of money in the grand scheme of things, right? And so until politicians are willing to like reject money, because after Parkland, Marco Rubio was confronted by Parkland survivors. They flat out asked him if he would go on record right there saying he would not take NRA money moving forward, and he said, "I will always take their money because their agenda and my agenda align." Right? They support me in what I do. So until we can get people either get money out of politics, the cynic in me has a real hard time, because when we didn't do anything following Sandy Hook and then we doubled down after Uvalde, I haven't had much hope. Right? It's one thing when it's high schoolers, right? Still kids dying. But when it's little kids, like 6 and 7 year olds, like we saw at Uvalde and at Sandy Hook, and we're just like, nah, fuck those kids, right? Like that was the United States' respective response after both of those events. I don't have a lot of hope. But let's move into what those things could look like, right? I'll give one of mine that has broad support, but let's talk about like what common sense gun reform could look like. One thing 88% of Democrats, 87% of Republicans agree on is if you're on the terrorist no-fly list, you should not be able to get a gun. Yet the NRA says that could restrict Americans' rights because they could be on there unjustly. And I'm like, fuck them. I have to take my shoes off at the airport. They can be on that. They can be without a gun until they get off that list. What are some things that that you think we can do? And if you want to add on to that point.
Sure. So when I ran for Congress in 2016, that was actually one of the issues that I talked about, was if you were on the terrorist watch list that you were not able to buy a gun. But before I get into that, I do want to go back to a point you made a minute ago about after Sandy Hook, nothing happened. That's only true at the federal level.
Right.
At the state level, there were a number of states that did go forward and enact some good common sense policies. So I want to make sure that at least we don't ignore there are activists at the local level trying to work any side of the government they can have access to.
That is fair. My concern is the only pushback we give is that we currently have a court that is kind of throwing away those state things, right? Like they just got rid of, the May issue in 7 states from the Bruin case in New York, and as I mentioned earlier, New York is one of the safest states in the country because of their laws related to who can have a gun and how they can have a gun. So when I'm speaking, I was speaking at the federal level because we're currently in a time where the state laws can be invalidated very quickly by this very conservative court that we have.
That's a whole conversation by itself, how corrupt our Supreme Court is. But one of the issues that I talked about a variety of them, but I talked about a couple main ones. One was being on the terrorist watch list. 2, getting rid of PLACA. That for some reason that does not get the traction that it should. But back in 2016, especially then, because Bernie Sanders was a candidate at the time for president, and he was an avid supporter of PLACA, and I wanted to repeal every single word of it. And he eventually, got on board with signing on to a bill that would have eliminated every single word of it. I also talked about waiting periods to buy guns. Here in Wisconsin, we had a 48-hour waiting period. The prior Republican governor repealed that using made-up scenarios and lies to basically do it. And all I kept doing was bringing up the Ronald Reagan op-ed that he wrote. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. Even the person who wrote the original 48-hour waiting period back in the 70s here in Wisconsin talked about how it would save people's lives in terms of gun suicides. So it was devastating that happened here in Wisconsin. But I talked a lot about those waiting periods and how it can put a barrier between someone who is in the throes of crisis to a lethal means of ending their life. And I would often equate it to suicide barriers that are on bridges in a lot of cities. And I would also I didn't talk about the assault weapon ban as much. That doesn't mean I don't agree with it. It's just because of my story, was involved with a handgun, which 9 out of 10 gun deaths are with a handgun, like my mom used. I felt like there were already people in that space, and it was really saturated already with voices talking about the mass shooting side of it. So I wanted to at least highlight the things that were really specific to my story. Given that I had a congressional platform, I'm going to use it. And I was able to get to really parlay that into when I was a part of Cory Booker's campaign in 2019. Part of his campaign included policy specifically written about my story. So I mean, you're taking something as an advocate, now it's a part of a presidential platform. That's the essence of advocacy, right? But I mean, I definitely want to make sure, like, if you were to say out of all the things we could, you can only pick one. The one I'm going to pick is going to be universal background checks on all gun sales. That's probably because it is so far reaching into all segments of gun violence. But that doesn't mean I don't value the other policy prescription that I know would save people's lives, like a 48-hour waiting period at least, or eliminating PLACA, the no-fly list. There's a variety of things that we can do that we know that not only will save people's lives, but don't actually do the things that the opponents say they will. I do agree with our Constitution and everything in it currently. I don't believe the Constitution is an infallible document. Part of it included at one point the 2/3 compromise, or the 3/5 compromise, I should say. Right. So I mean, it is a changeable document, and as it should. I mean, Benjamin Franklin told us that we should, as we evolve, continue to change the Constitution.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that is there anything wrong with the Second Amendment. I think it is has been perverted over the years, and has been turned into something that it was never intended to be.
Yeah.
Is now used solely and purely for marketing purposes only. Nothing at all about self-defense. The thing that people like, it really gets to me when people want to like latch on to this issue of self-defense and protecting your home, and they'll have Guns and Ammo magazine and all these things, but do you have like ADT magazine?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have Alarm magazine? Like, do you really care about like home security, or is it that you're just a part of the gun culture?
Yeah, like Jim Jeffries makes a great joke. I don't know if you've ever seen his stand-up where he talks about the guns, but he's like, nobody goes to padlock conventions, right? Like, you're not going to home security conventions, you're going to these gun conventions. To kind of build off that, like some of mine, I do agree the universal background checks. I would like to see at least an annual psych eval as part of that, as being a gun owner. Probably more than that, though, because we all deal with mental issues, and that may be a way that then we start, we talked about how, like, it's not readily available, but it's also, like, cost prohibitive. Most insurance policies do not cover mental health services, right? You pay out of pocket, and they reimburse you a percentage later. Like, I get my reimbursement, like, 6 weeks later after I go. So, I would like to see at least an annual, but I would prefer quarterly, like, just uptick. If you don't have a gun, you need to be checked to make sure you're mentally stable for one. And Antonin Scalia said that's constitutional because in the Heller decision he says it is not, that my decision is not to preclude longstanding prohibitions on people with mental illness or criminals from having guns, right? So I think that falls in with the constitutionality of it all. But to go back to like the Second Amendment, if we actually look at Madison's original amendment, the original amendment was written: the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, semicolon, a militia being necessary to the security of a free state, is the best will of the people, but no people religiously scrupulous should be forced into military service, right? That was the original amendment. The Founding Fathers said, fuck that, and they rewrote it to say that the well-regulated militia shall not be infringed. And to further show that that's what they meant, if you actually turn to the Constitution, go to Article 1, go to Section 8, go to subsection 15 and 16, it says Congress controls the military and the militia. They determine what they are armed with, how they are trained, and then the militia is turned over to the states, and the Second Amendment is to further indemnify it, because Virginia was a slave state. They wanted to make sure the federal government did not take away their slaves, as we were talking about with the Three-Fifths Compromise, because they're responsible for that too. And they wanted the Second Amendment to make sure they could have slave patrols, that they could have militia, state-run militia, to enforce that institution of slavery. And then in the 1970s, we start seeing the NRA pushing for this individual right to gun ownership, which led Chief Justice Warren Burger, one of the most conservative justices of the time, to say that the idea the Constitution grants an individual right to ownership is the greatest fraud perpetuated against the American people.
Yeah, I look at that. I have it on my phone. I have the actual video, not the link, but the actual video of that interview on my phone. And I think the NRA and the entire gun death lobby as a whole has really been able to craft something that they were able to find this little thing in people and really hyper focus on and get them to believe something that isn't there, right? Whether it's the othering, like, those other people might come and do these things, or being perpetually afraid to the point where common sense no longer prevails. It is the fear that prevails. And it is really analogous to, so the whole gun lobby movement is analogous to the MAGA movement. It's all rooted in fear and othering. Like, you want to protect yourself from those other people, those bad people, but ignoring, like, well, are they really lying to me? And that's the thing, I think, I don't know if this is the silver lining in it, but at some point, I believe the overwhelming majority of people are going to wake up one day, at some point, and realize how much they've been lied to. whether it's by Donald Trump or the entire gun lobby. It'll be, unfortunately, it might take it happening to them where gun violence visits their doorstep. I hope it doesn't. I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy. But sometimes people have to have that happen, have to have the tragedy befall them before they realize, like, oh, I was wrong. I hope they are able to have their come to Jesus moment without that. But I think they're going to wake up one day by whatever impetus it happens and realize how much they've been lied to and how much they've been used. Like whether it's the MAGA followers or people who are in the gun culture are going to wake up and realize that they have been a pawn in someone else's game and that they have never at all had control over themselves or the things that they think they want. They've been programmed to want these things and are only putting more and more money in people's pockets that have nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
The gun lobby does not care one way or another if you were safe or not. They actually want you to feel more afraid so you buy more of their shit.
Yeah, no, I think that's all really good points. I want to touch on two things, and then I'll pass back to you. So first, like this idea that MAGA is analogous with the gun lobby. I think that's more true than most people realize, right? Like the NRA today is not the NRA of 1976, right? In 1977, 1,000 members, the more extreme, crazy members, took over the institution. In a lot of ways, the NRA membership kind of placated them and ignored them just to get their votes and support and money, and just kind of like didn't think much of them until they took over the organization, right? And then it became what it is today, and became the NRA that most of us think of as the Institute of Legislative Action, which isn't really the NRA; it's their lobbying arm, right? But MAGA kind of did the same thing to the Republican Party, right? And before that, it was the Tea Party, right? You saw these radical extremists coming up in the Republican Party, and the Republicans, rather than say, nah, y'all need to sit the fuck down and shut up, you are not like us, you're not part of us, they're like, yeah, we like you, we agree with you, you're good, we want your vote. And now they've taken over the party, right? Because they started as Tea Party, and then that didn't really coalesce anywhere. But when Trump ran, they have made that their whole identity. And now it's really hard to look at the Republican Party and separate like the traditional John McCain, Ronald Reagan conservative from the Trump conservative, right? Like they would call Ronald Reagan a liberal because they call John McCain a liberal.
Yeah, I mean, think of it this way. Adam Kinzinger is speaking at the DNC convention this week.
Yeah.
That tells you all you need to know.
And Kinzinger voted with Trump like 89, 90% of the time, right? Like he's still super conservative. Like I'm glad like he voted, he did the bare minimum and called Trump out, right? But he's not on our side. He does not vote in our favor in our way, right? But he's become kind of this leftist hero.
To me, it's like, at least you can have a conversation with him.
Yeah.
You can find some common ground, or at least find some things that that you can join forces with, and then go combat that issue. I mean, a good example of this, when I ran for Congress in 2016, my team and I were out one spring morning at a farmer's market in one of the most conservative counties in Wisconsin. I think it's actually the most conservative county. And as you can tell, I like to talk, right? But when you're getting signatures, it's very transactional. It's really quick. You're 30 to 90 seconds. I don't do that. I want to go and actually talk to people. And so like this woman's walking up to me, and she's, I'm guessing in her 70s. She's, older woman. And I just say, hey, I'm running for Congress. Would you like to support me in signing my nomination form? Didn't even answer my question, by the way. She went on a 17 or 18 minute rant about every Tea Party, every anti-choice talking point, every NRA talk, all these things. My ears were like bleeding on the inside. I just was like, oh my God. But I just didn't interrupt her. Just didn't say anything. Just let her have her moment. And then like at around the 18-minute mark, and she says, here's one thing that really does bother me. when a child gets access to a gun and they shoot themselves or someone else, that the gun owner still can get the gun back. That is the only time in that 18-minute stretch that I stopped it. I said, hold on a second. How about you and I go be the champions for that one issue? Let's forget about the things we don't agree on. Let's go fight for this one issue and be the champions for it and fix it rather than argue about the things we don't agree with. So by the time that conversation was over, she said, I've been voting for Jim Sensenbrenner. That was my opponent. For 40 years, he's never talked to me once. And so this raging Tea Party Republican went on and voted for me. And, it was because I listened to her. Now, that doesn't mean I agreed with anything she said out of that one thing. But, I wasn't really validating that she was right. I was just giving her the space to feel heard. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the same thing with Adam Kinzinger. Like, I don't think he and I are going to ever team up and vote for, advocate for something that, you wouldn't expect a Republican to do. But I do think, though, he'd be a good person to sit down and talk to and say, tell me why you don't support background checks. Or tell me why you don't support a 48-hour waiting period to buy a gun. So we can have better understanding of what we are up against. So we can write better policy and have better advocacy positions so we can take this to a broader audience now knowing what the opposition is saying. Mm-hmm. But you can only get that from a person who's willing to have those kind of conversations. Marjorie Taylor Greene's not going to tell us.
Right.
But a reasonable person like Adam Kinzinger would. Yeah. And that's why I think, our policy differences aside, the fact that we can talk, and I think that's the way forward. Being able to have those kind of reasonable conversations, even when we disagree, is understanding why we disagree. Mm-hmm. And is there something in the middle that we can agree on? Maybe we don't get 10 out of 10 things done, but can we get 5? Can we get 4? And find a way forward doing it that.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I do. And one thing I can say positive about Adam Kinzinger is that I would trust him because I know where he stands, right? Mm-hmm. I said the same thing about John McCain, right? I would never agree with McCain on most things politically, right? He and I are very different people, have very different views, but I always knew where I stood with John mm-hmm. McCain. Same with Jeff Flake, same with Adam Kinzinger, right? Like, I know where I stand with them, and they stand behind whatever they say. He doesn't change and flip-flop and without having real evidence to support, hey, this is why I did something differently, right? So I can respect that part of it. So I can kind of agree with what you said. To kind of, touch on a little bit too, like thinking about the conversations that we have, part of my research has involved taking the things that the NRA says guns do for us and actually examining, is any of that true, right? Mm-hmm. And, so that's where it really began. But part of it is also tearing down some of these social narratives, right? So some things make gun owners look really good, some don't, and it kind of goes back and forth. So like the very first paper we published looked at the rhetoric in society that gun owners only have guns because they're cowards, right? And we found that's not actually true in most cases. Yes, they're afraid of crime and being victimized in crime. That part is true. But when you look at fear generally, gun owners have less fear. And so that led us down this road that we've gone down with the research where we're like, if we start a conversation where I'm like, you only want a gun because you have a small dick, because that's our newest paper, right? Like, or you only want a gun because you're a coward. And none of that is true. We've begun with an insult. They're not going to sit down in the conversation and have a conversation with us. And I use this kind of rhetoric. I actually went on an NRA podcast. The guy ended up getting fired after because the people who listened were like, I agree with that guy. I agree with what he was saying. The NRA did not like that. And that's why they don't ever respond to me on social media, even though I tag them in everything. They don't like me. They like I said, they got Davis fired because of being by the end of the podcast, he was like, I think I could agree with most of what you've said. But going back to it is that if we get rid of what's not true, right, so that we come to the conversation with what is true, right, like I understand why you want a gun. It's not because you're a coward. You know, the new paper is called Size Matters, right? Like, and looks at whether people who have perceptions of their penises as being inadequate own a gun as a compensatory device. Turns out that they don't. That's not connected, right? So if we start with like taking those rhetorics and say, hey, we know none of this is true, right? Here's what is true, right? Let's have a conversation so that you can still have your right, but we can keep people safe.
I think that goes back to, you know, you're talking about the no-fly list, and the argument is, well, it's hard to get off that list, or someone who shouldn't be on it could be on it, now they can't have a gun or something like that. Because I think it's gotten to a point where they are overvaluing a perceived right more so than a life. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting, it'll be the pro-life people that are doing it. Mm-hmm. And I have not been able to understand how that can be possible. How you can be so pro-life that you want to restrict a woman's right to decide what's right for her body. But when children are dying in their schools, and I mean, I remember learning about tornado drills. Now it's active shooter drills. And the kind of trauma that comes with that, I mean, that you may not be able to recover from it. Yep. And we are conditioning kids to be, you know, terrified in school. I think that's cruel by itself, but I think it's just a weird dynamic that we have allowed people to proclaim being pro-life while being so pro-gun. And they are ignoring the devastation that are happening across communities, especially communities of color, that they don't want to talk about. And then they want to use they'll bring up Chicago, which is a misnomer by itself.
Racist
what about
talking
Chicago?
point.
Right. But they don't actually care about Chicago. No. If you did, you'd want to be on our side trying to prevent gun deaths in Chicago, but you don't want to. You just want to use that as a talking point to try to win an argument. I don't give a shit about your argument. I don't give a shit about the conversation in terms of who's going to win or who's going to lose. I want to do the things that are going to help save people's lives. Either you're going to be in that conversation to do that, or I don't want to have anything to do with you. Well, if you go back to the conversation you and I had, the very first thing, what did I tell you? I'm not going to argue with you. I'm not going to do any of those things. You want to have a conversation about how we can save lives? Great. I'm not debating anybody. Because it is a self-defeating prophecy, because you've got one person only concerning about talking points and winning the argument, and me trying to save people's lives. And I don't care where you come from, what side of the aisle you stand on, what letters next to your name. Doesn't matter to me.
No, like, so Chicago is a censored word on all of my videos on TikTok, right? Like, I don't allow that word because it is a racist talking point, right?
Sure.
And Chicago is not even in the top 30 most dangerous major cities, right? Like, and it's not really that bad in cities overall. For instance, like Ocala, Florida has a gun homicide rate of like 70 per 100,000. Chicago's is like nearly 50, right? But it's still like significantly higher in Ocala, Florida, which has a population of like 68,000 people, right? You are statistically much more likely to be shot and killed in a gun homicide there. But we don't talk about that. We don't talk about St. Louis, Missouri, which is number one, right? But they'll bring up any majority black city, right? Like Chicago or Baltimore or Detroit. And they'll ignore other cities that are in rural red areas. Mississippi has the highest rate of gun mortality in the country at around 30, 31 per 100,000. They don't have any major cities like Jackson, which has like 50,000 people, right? They'll ignore those cities. And so like I find that the people who bring those up, they're disingenuous. As you're saying, it's just to derail a conversation. It's not even about winning the argument. It's about trying to derail and shut down the conversation, because they're like, well, Chicago has all these problems, so Illinois is the best gun control in the country, which isn't true. But also, it's Illinois is much better than states like Texas and Ohio and Indiana, right? Alabama and Mississippi, where all their guns come from that are
Right.
used in crime.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a gun store, actually, where I bought my gun from in the early 2000s that I don't have it. But it used to be called Badger Guns and Ammo. Badger Guns and Ammo at the time, and I think it was 2005 or 6, was the leading provider of crime guns in America. And do you know why that it was allowed to happen for so long? PLACA. That is purely why. And then, you know, the first case in the country that was allowed to proceed under PLACA that pierced that veil was that very same story. It's
I
because
did not realize that.
yeah, because they had sold a gun to a guy who was with another guy, so it was clearly a straw purchase. The dealer was basically allowing it to happen, just didn't care enough, and they used it to maim 2 police officers. One lost an eye, one I forget what happened to the other one, but they sued and they won. And that was the first case to pierce the veil of PLACA. And to see how full circle that one came was pretty, unfortunately given the context, but it was pretty awe-inspiring that people just did not give up trying to deal with the issue of bad dealers. But when you mentioned the Midwest and how the surrounding states were providing guns to Illinois, Wisconsin was notorious for doing so.
Yep.
Because of that one gun store.
Yeah, and so for the listeners that don't know, we did talk about PLACA last week, but for a reminder, that's the Protection of Lawful Commerce of Arms Act, I believe is what that stands for. But it basically protects gun stores from being held liable in any instance where their weapons are used for nefarious purchases later. So like, you know, the straw purchases, basically they can't be held liable. I believe wasn't that passed in 2005? It's
Yes.
been a while. It's been almost 20 years now. And it is one, along with the Dickey Amendment, that I would love to see gone.
But PLACA is one of those things where it has been really perverted and has really stymied progress. So you can actually get the industries themselves to do a lot of policing on their own because they don't want regulation themselves. They don't like it, you know. So if you inspired them to want to police themselves, to course correct, a lot of the issues will be gone. But PLACA prevents them. There's no incentive for them to do any policing. So it's not just the dealer; it's the entire gun industry that benefits from PLACA, whether it's the manufacturer of the gun all the way down to the hauler of the gun. And everybody in between is protected from congressional immunity so that they can say and do anything they want with no fear of accountability whatsoever. And I think that is, there really is no other kind of protection like that.
Well,
Even when
I'd
you
say the
think
closest
about
thing, I would say the closest thing is qualified immunity for law enforcement.
that's close.
Yeah.
But that still doesn't have...
Still not as much, but that's the closest thing.
And there's another one that's somewhat close, and that is with the pharmaceutical industry. If there's something that happens with pills, but there still is a way to get compensation from a victim fund that set up through that. But even with PLACA, there's nothing. They have, like with qualified immunity, there's still some limitations, but even still, it's so finite to where it is just the officer, right? But with PLACA, you got the hauler, the dealer, the manufacturer, the marketer, all kinds of people and entities within this industry that have such blanket protection. It's like, well, they can do anything they want, and they have. But that's why, like, if you get rid of that, man, you can save a lot.
Yeah, it would change a lot of things. Like the two laws that I would love to get rid of, PLACA and then the Dickey Amendment. And for the listeners, Dickey Amendment prevents us from doing gun research. It was started on the CDC, expanded to NIH in 2012, but basically says that if they fund any research that is then turned around and used for gun control. So if they funded me and then someone years later took my research that was published to Congress and said, this is why we need gun control, the CDC and NIH could be stripped of all federal funding. So then they're not able to research anything, right? Which has basically been considered a moratorium on gun research, which is why we're always arguing basic associations. We have 20 years of data on the CDC website right now, and all 20 years show states with stricter laws have fewer gun deaths. I can't tell you why that is. I can't tell you what law it is that actually is like, what combination of laws or what singular law it is that makes those deaths lower. I have no idea because we can't research it. That's the first one. And then this where we're protecting, just carte blanche protect of everybody involved in the gun industry.
But it is wrong. I mean, what's interesting, we talked a minute ago about how you have these pro-life people being pro-gun, which to me is, mind-boggling. But now you have the same thing with people proclaiming to be so patriotic and love the country that they still hate the government, right? They hate the government so much that we don't let it do what it's supposed to do in helping solve these monumental and tragic and traumatic problems. For the fear that this government might turn tyrannical, but like, wait a minute, aren't you a part of the government? You know what I mean? Like, you got, whether it's convict Trump or you got Jim in Ohio, I forgot his last name now.
Jim Jordan
or whoever.
Yeah.
You are a part of the government while railing against the government that you're a part of. But like, you are a part of the problem. And again, they just want the issue, not the solution.
Yeah. It's kind of frustrating that there are so many people in our government who are so anti-government, right? Like, and are just trying to tear down structures and things like that. Jim Jordan, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, Matt Gaetz being the top ones I can think of, because they're not interested in creating solutions, right? They're just there for the chaos of it all, and to make as much money so that when they retire they can go get that Fox News gig or Newsmax gig or whatever the hell it is. Yeah, exactly. But they don't have the interests of the American people at heart at all. And I think that's the turning point in our government, like, to kind of shift gears just a little bit, right? Like, in the past, we could point out evidence that racism and other things drive, like, policy on the right, especially, right? Like, both sides are guilty of that, but the right especially, right? Ronald Reagan, for instance, as governor of California, banned open carry because he was afraid of the Black Panther Party, right? Because they were marching with guns. And, even with the semi-automatic weapons ban, he's evoking language of, like, the Chicago, right? Like the violence on the streets. And even Barack Obama made a comment, about Chicago and the violence following Sandy Hook. So we see that those kind of rhetorics are there, but there was always this idea that it's about policy differences and people can have civil conversations. And that's not necessarily the case anymore, right? There are fewer and fewer people willing to, like, meet, compromise, come up with solutions for things, because we have so many people who are just there to, like, get clicks and get, likes on social media.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we had the Sikh temple mass shooting here a number of years ago. And there were 8 people shot and killed in the temple. One of the sons of the main person, I forgot the name of the title, but Pardeep is his name, befriended someone who was at the time, a white supremacist. And they have gone on tour all over the country. They wrote a book together. And in essence, it talks about how, like, trying to bridge that divide between what you thought I was to what I really am, like looking at another person's differences and trying to find some commonality. So the essence of what happened in the Sikh temple is a racist white supremacist thought the members of the Sikh community were Muslim. They aren't. And he did that solely because they were turbans. And he went in and shot all these people up, killed them. And Pardeep was like, "Well, I think the best way to do this is to start having conversations." The shooter had a son, and the people at the temple was like, "Give the son to us, we will raise him, so the child doesn't become an orphan." The kind of like heart that takes, right, to be that giving and to wanting to be that kind of open and forgiving.
I'm gonna be honest. I'm gonna be honest. I am not religious, right? Like, I'm agnostic. But if I were going to adopt a human religion that is still in practice today, they're the best example, right?
Mhm.
Like, I have such respect for them. I study religion as part of what I do. Mostly I focus on evangelicals, but like a lot of my publications look at religion and the grace that community has, right? It is just overwhelming, the level of forgiveness, because I've seen those documentaries with him and the guy traveling around, and it's just like, I was like, wow.
But I mean, like, I think if people were more interested in trying to make a difference rather than trying to be defined, I think our world, well, at least America, would be in a much better place. I mean, people would be healthier and happier. We'd have less trauma, less violence. But that really isn't there. I mean, I keep going back to it, that you have too many people who want the issue. They just don't want the solution. Having been involved in politics for so long, you hear people say these talking points. It's like, but what are you trying to do about it? Like, you can bring, to go back to Chicago. Like, what would you like to see happen? You can be as tough on crime as you want, which, as you see what's happened with convict Trump, that they really aren't tough on crime. But I mean, someone is dying. How are you just being tough on crime and not dealing with the part of that equation that took someone's life? Another argument I'm sure you hear all the time is, guns don't kill people, people kill people. And usually my first visceral response to that is that the bullet that exploded my mom's head wasn't injured in doing so don't worry about the gun, it's just fine. But then once I'm calm and all that, I usually say, when was the last time you cut the grass? Right? Did you use a pair of scissors or a lawnmower? Which one made it easier? It's usually the lawnmower. I mean, unless you're like, maybe you're an artisan and you want to go out there and you actually want to cut your lawn with a pair of scissors, but you'll be out there for a while.
Yeah.
And that's analogous to your point earlier about the mass stabbings. It's the same thing. One is a more efficient killing machine.
Yeah. I do like to, when they bring that up, though, I do like to bring up the lawsuit against 6 Hour, where they have a gun that just randomly goes off. It can be laying on a table and it can just start shooting, or in a holster and go off, like because it was used by law enforcement nationwide, adopted by law enforcement. There's a massive lawsuit against the 6 Hour company for having this gun that would just shoot people at will, randomly. And there are stories every year, very small, but there's, tens of these events where a gun is in a place, no human hand is touching it, it goes off. Usually no one is injured, but it does happen. People do get injured, do die from that. But it's a disingenuous argument, because most of the gun laws aren't even aimed at the gun, it's at the person who might be buying the gun, right? Like, I'm trying to regulate you. I'm not trying to regulate the gun itself, because I'm not really into bans, right? I don't think, yes, the semi-automatic weapon ban worked. We know from the data there was like 7.2 deaths per year before the ban went into effect, dropped to 5.4 while the ban was in effect. It's like 35, 40, a year now, right? And just keeps growing and growing as mass shootings get more and more out of control. We know it works, but at the same time, I don't think it's necessary. Right? I think there are things we can do, like we mentioned earlier about the no-fly list, mental health checks, better, more rigorous background checks that can reduce these kinds of events. But those aren't regulating the gun, that's regulating the person who could get the gun.
Right, the access to it, yeah. So people, when they say it to me, it's like, I have never, not once in my entire 46 years on Earth, have I ever blamed the gun that my mom used to take her own life with. I blame her access to it.
Yeah.
So if the gun wasn't there, she wouldn't have shot herself. Now, she had attempted before, and in neither case was she able to complete those attempts, but she obviously did with that gun. If that gun had not been there, maybe I'd still have my mouth. And oftentimes, I mean, to go back to some of the stuff we talked about in the first hour, was, people who, especially those who are in opposition of me, will say something cruel like, well, she would have just found a way. Well, now you want me to imagine or hypothesize about another way my mom could have ended her life. Like, could you get any less human in doing so? But if you remove the gun from the equation, I have at least a better chance of my mom still being. And that is true for nearly all the other people who have attempted with a gun. You remove that means you have a better chance of keeping it. And I think people are getting to the point where the cruelty is the point. Like they just like being mean. But that goes back to the earlier point that you made about toxic masculinity, where we equate being tough and mean with being a man. Like, no, it's not.
Yeah.
That's not humane. That's not being a decent person. And you'll often find there'll be the same people who want to profess how Christian they are.
Yeah.
I'm a Christian man.
Well, one of our papers that we published on Donald Trump was called "Valorizing Trump's Masculine Self." Yeah, and it's it talks about that very thing, that they like Trump because of that attitude. All right, so we're winding down to the last 10 minutes. Why don't you take the next 5-6 minutes, give your final thoughts. Floor is completely yours. I won't interrupt you, and then I'll close this out.
I think, honestly, our country is in a much better place than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago in a variety of aspects, but especially as it relates to gun violence prevention. I think there are a number of groups, both nationally and locally, who have learned how to advocate on the issue effectively, learning the right terms to use, learning effective means to communicate, learning who to talk to, and learning whose voices need to be elevated. For too long, you'll only see the spokespeople of an organization rather than those of us who are the actual survivors of the thing you are trying to prevent. But more and more organizations are now really pushing survivor stories and voices to the forefront. So we are the faces of the conversation. When you talk about gun violence, too many times we're talking about the issue in an abstract term. You're looking at it in a pure black and white substance, almost like you're just looking at it statistically. But there are faces to this issue. I am one of the faces of gun violence. My mom, Joyce, completed suicide with a gun. There are too many stories like hers that you'll never hear about. It happens every single day. More than 50 people complete suicide with a gun every single day. More than, there's about 90 some people that die a day overall from gun violence that we don't even talk about. And I think it's time we look at people and talk about their stories, not just the ones that are shot and killed, but those that survive, the family members that survive and talk about it. Let them be the voice of the issue to give them the chance to turn their tragedy into something good, so you have fewer and fewer stories that sound like mine. Because I trust me when I tell you, and you don't ever want to take a step in my shoes.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a great way to kind of end out, because when Brett and I, sat down and, wrote this out, like this is what this radio show was going to be, it's exactly what you just said, right? Because too often the focus is on the people who commit gun violence, and when we talk about victims at all, it's like, this person, a child was killed or a person died. We don't name the victims often. We don't name the survivors, right? Like it's like victim number 42. There are stories about Brett's son, Uzziah, that they don't name him. They just said, there were, 22 people killed, including so many children. Never naming any of these people. And that, I think, adds a layer of abstraction, which then allows people to kind of like ignore it, right? And become complacent with it because it's not humanized. And that's a lot of what this radio show set out to do, is to kind of humanize some of those elements.
Mm-hmm.
So, we're going to go ahead and end here tonight. I want to thank everybody for sticking around and listening to us. We will be back next week. Eventually, hopefully, we reach a point where we have no more stories to tell. But until then, signing off. Let's see. 1 second. It's not letting me end the recording.